1959, the height of the Cold War. Two superpowers locked in a silent, suffocating arms race, each one building weapons so devastating they could never actually be used. But somewhere deep inside a classified Soviet design bureau, engineers were not just building a tank. They were building something that defied every rational limit of armored warfare. Something so extreme, so radical, so brutally over-engineered that even the Soviet military, a force that had swallowed the T-34, the IS-2, and the most punishing conditions on Earth, looked at it and said, enough. This is the story of Object 279. And once you understand what it could do, you will understand why they buried it. Imagine a tank that could survive 4 separate nuclear detonations before its crew was in any meaningful danger. Not from the blast wave, not from the thermal pulse, not from the electromagnetic chaos of a nuclear exchange tearing apart the European theater. 4 detonations. That number is not speculation. That is the design requirement Soviet engineers built this machine around. In an era when every major power was openly discussing the use of tactical nuclear weapons on the conventional battlefield, the engineers at the Kirov Plant in Leningrad sat down and asked a question no one else dared to ask. What does a tank look like if the battlefield itself is nuclear? The answer was Object 279. To understand why this machine existed, you have to understand the world it was born into. By the mid-1950s, NATO strategists had accepted something terrifying. Conventional Soviet ground forces outnumbered Western armies on the European continent by margins that were, frankly, impossible to close with infantry and armor alone. The response from the West was the New Look doctrine, a strategic posture built on the threat of tactical nuclear weapons. Battlefield nukes. Small yield devices designed not to destroy cities, but to obliterate armored columns, vaporize logistics networks, and simply kill the momentum of a Soviet armored thrust before it could reach the Rhine. The Soviets watched. They understood. And certain Soviet designers began to think the unthinkable. What if our tanks had to advance through a nuclear strike? Not around it. Not before it. Through it. Through the overpressure wave, through the radiation, through terrain that had been churned into radioactive debris fields where no conventional vehicle could operate. What would that machine need to look like? The answer came from a man named Leonid Troyanov, one of the most gifted and underappreciated tank designers in Soviet history. Troyanov had spent the war years developing heavy breakthrough tanks. He understood mass, he understood armor, and he understood that the problems of tomorrow required solutions that looked nothing like the machines of yesterday. In 1956, his team at the Kirov Plant began preliminary work on what would become one of the most extraordinary armored vehicles ever conceived by any nation on Earth. The first thing you notice about Object 279 is the hull. It does not look like a tank. It looks like something that should not exist. The hull is not rectangular, not boxy, not angular in any conventional sense. It is elliptical, a vast curved, almost egg-shaped body of cast steel, sloped and rounded on every surface to deflect blast overpressure. The engineering logic is precise. A curved surface deflects a shockwave far more efficiently than a flat one. When a nuclear weapon detonates, the pressure wave radiates outward in all directions. A flat-sided tank acts like a wall. It absorbs that pressure and transmits it inward. The curved hull of Object 279 acts like a lens. It redirects the shockwave around and past the vehicle. The crew inside, theoretically, survives. The armor itself was extraordinary. The hull was constructed from cast steel up to 305 millimeters thick at its most critical points. That is not rolled, homogeneous armor. That is cast, shaped in molds, allowing for those complex curved geometries that flat plate simply cannot achieve. The overall weight of the vehicle reached 60.4 tons. For context, the legendary Tiger, one of the Second World War, weighed 57 tons. Object 279 was heavier, and it was doing things the Tiger never dreamed of. Then there was the running gear. Because here is a problem the egg-shaped hull immediately creates. How do you move 60 tons of nuclear-proof steel across terrain that has been physically altered by a nuclear detonation? Blast craters, collapsed bridges, ground that has been compressed, fractured, or rendered impassable. Troyanov's answer was radical. Instead of 2 conventional tracks, Object 279 used 4 tracks, 4 independent track assemblies arranged in pairs, giving the vehicle an extraordinary ground contact area. The ground pressure, the weight distributed per square centimeter, was lower than many lighter vehicles. It could cross terrain that would swallow conventional tanks entirely. It could, in theory, navigate the edge of a blast crater. It could push through rubble fields. It was designed to keep moving when everything around it had stopped. The main armament was the M65 gun, a 100mm rifled cannon capable of firing both conventional armor-piercing rounds and, critically, nuclear-capable ammunition. Because this was not just a vehicle built to survive nuclear war. It was built to fight in it, to absorb the blast, keep the crew alive, and then return fire with a weapon that could defeat any armor on the planet at that time. The fire control systems were advanced for the era. A stabilization system allowed the gun to remain on target while the vehicle moved. A full NBC, nuclear, biological, and chemical, protection suite was integrated into the design from the very beginning. This was not an afterthought. This was the core design philosophy made metal. Only 4 prototypes were ever completed. 4 machines, each one representing thousands of hours of engineering, countless classified documents, and a vision of armored warfare so extreme it made the Soviet General Staff deeply uncomfortable. By 1960, the prototype was ready for evaluation. The tests that followed would confirm something remarkable, but they would also set in motion the events that would doom this incredible machine forever. The evaluation trials of 1960 were, by any technical measure, a success. Object 279 performed almost exactly as its designers had intended. It crossed terrain that stopped conventional vehicles cold. Its nuclear survivability figures were unprecedented. The curved hull behaved precisely as the mathematics had predicted, deflecting simulated blast overpressure in ways that kept the interior environment survivable. The 4-track system gripped broken ground with a tenacity that astonished the evaluation teams. On paper, Troyanov had done the impossible. He had built a tank that could fight on a nuclear battlefield and win. And yet the Soviet military looked at what he had built and said no. The reasons were not technical. They were strategic. They were political. And they were, in their own way, completely rational. In 1961, Nikita Khrushchev issued a directive that would reshape the entire Soviet armored program. No new tank design would be approved for production if it exceeded the weight of 47 tons. The directive was not arbitrary. Khrushchev's military thinking had shifted decisively toward missiles, ballistic weapons, intercontinental range, the tools of strategic deterrence rather than conventional battlefield dominance. Heavy tanks, in his view, were relics of a thinking that no longer served the Soviet Union's strategic interests. They were expensive. They were difficult to transport. They strained bridges, broke roads, and consumed logistics resources at a rate that made operational planners reach for aspirin. Object 279, at 60.4 tons, was dead on arrival. But the weight limit alone does not fully explain why this machine disappeared so completely. To understand that, you have to compare it with what the Soviet Union chose instead. The T-54 and its successor, the T-55, represented everything Object 279 was not. They were simple. They were cheap. They were producible in the tens of thousands. A single Object 279 cost, in terms of materials, manufacturing complexity, and engineering time, what might equate to several standard production tanks. The 4-track running gear, for all its brilliance, was an engineering nightmare to maintain in the field. The complex cast hull required manufacturing tolerances that Soviet industry could achieve, but not at scale, and scale was everything. Soviet doctrine was built on mass, on the sheer, overwhelming numerical superiority of armored formations that could absorb catastrophic losses and keep advancing. A tank you could build by the thousands was infinitely more valuable than a tank you could build by the handful, regardless of how extraordinary that handful was. Against its Western contemporaries, the picture was equally unforgiving. The British Conqueror heavy tank, the American M103, these were also heavy, also expensive, also strategically awkward. Both were being phased out of service at roughly the same moment Object 279 was being cancelled. The entire concept of the heavy breakthrough tank was dying simultaneously on both sides of the Iron Curtain, killed not by any single weapon, but by the shifting logic of nuclear age warfare itself. When the battlefield might be nuclear, you did not want fewer, heavier, more expensive vehicles. You wanted mobility, you wanted dispersion, you wanted vehicles that could survive by moving fast and spreading wide, not by being too armored to kill. Object 279 had been designed to solve a problem that military doctrine was actively walking away from. The 4 prototypes were not destroyed. They were not scrapped or melted down. They were simply put away, stored, classified, forgotten beneath layers of Soviet bureaucratic silence. One example survived the decades intact. Today it sits at the Kubinka Tank Museum outside Moscow, where it draws visitors who stop in front of it and stare with the particular expression people reserve for things that should not exist. The elliptical hull, the 4 tracks, the sheer physical presence of a machine that looks like it was designed by someone who had been told the rules and chosen to ignore every single one of them. Troyanov himself continued working. His genius did not disappear with his most extraordinary creation. But Object 279 remained the high water mark, the point at which Soviet armored engineering reached furthest into the impossible and briefly, gloriously touched it. No shot was ever fired from its gun in anger. No crew ever took it into battle. It never crossed a real blast crater or pushed through a real rubble field. It was cancelled before the world could test whether its designers were right. And perhaps that is the most haunting thing about it. Not that it failed, but that it was never allowed to find out. Some weapons are forgotten because they were useless. Some are forgotten because they were superseded. Object 279 was forgotten because the world it was built for? A world where armored columns advanced through nuclear fire was a world no one wanted to actually create. It was a perfect answer to a question humanity chose, just barely not to ask. If machines like this one deserve to be remembered, then subscribe. Because there are more forgotten war machines waiting to be found.